It's good to be home after a couple of weeks away. A busy time for our family, a wedding in Vermont, and the funeral of memorial service for my birth mother in Virginia. About 2,000 miles of driving all told. Got a little more complicated because just before our trip, Susan's father, my wife's father, took a turn for the worse, and so she and her sister flew out to Arizona to be with him. Had a wonderful time with him for an evening. He perked up and was able to talk with them, and then he died the next day. And so she flew to Rochester, New York, because I was driving from Michigan, so I picked her up on my way out to Vermont. We found the airport kind of in the middle and kept going. That's the kind of trip it was. During that time, of course, we lost two other beloved parishioners. Rob, our dear brother in Christ, died, and I'm so grateful to Father John for conducting the funeral. So grateful for his presence here, and so great to see his family. And then another parishioner, Carl DePew. Some of you may have known Carl. Carl and Kathy used to sit over there. They came to the 10 o'clock service. They've been, since COVID, dealing with health issues and haven't been able to be here. But Carl also passed away. And then yesterday I went to the memorial service for Mary, Jack's mother, down at Trinity Farmington Hills. And it's been quite a season of memorial services and deaths. And most of those services I have not been part of leading, which is strange for me. I'm used to being the one not so much worshiping, but managing all of the details. And so I had a different perspective on these services. I got to be a parishioner. I got to sit, and most important, to listen. And as you may know, a custom now in most funerals did not used to be permitted in the Episcopal Church, but now the custom is to have a eulogy or remembrance by usually one or a couple of the family. And in those eulogies often are expressed some of the great highlights or themes of a person's life, special memories that were meaningful, and sometimes also a sense of the legacy that they are passing on, that lives on thanks to their life. And all of that I would put under the heading of wisdom. Hearing the stories of Jack's mom, hearing the stories about my birth mother, most of those stories I wasn't part of. My sister gave the eulogy, and I wasn't around for a good chunk of that time, so I learned a lot about the wisdom that comes from a full and well-lived life. Wisdom is something that is not a guarantee in life, right? We don't necessarily gain in wisdom. We hope so, but it's different from a lot of other things. I was thinking about that. We live in an age, we call it the information age. It's the hallmark of our time, this moment in human history. We are bombarded. We have access right this second to more information than has ever been available to any human being in history. We have so much information. We call it surfing the web, but I like to think of it as trying not to drown in the web, right? It's too much. It's an overwhelming amount of information. It's hard to make sense of it. And so we try to do that. We amass this information and we call it knowledge. We gain insight and understanding by trying to impose some kind of order on all this information. But knowledge is not the same thing as wisdom. You can have a lot of knowledge and not be very wise. And that is probably more true than I like to think about in many ways, right? There's also knowledge that's applied to our life, which we call skill, right? If you go to school to become a professional, a musician, a doctor, a teacher, an engineer, right? You are taking all that knowledge, but you're applying it in terms of skill. And as you gain experience with that skill, you perhaps gain a sense of mastery in your area of expertise. But that still is not the same as wisdom. Information, knowledge, skill, mastery, all important, but what makes wisdom different? Wisdom has a different quality. It is the combination of knowledge plus experience. It's very hard to have wisdom without living for a while, right? Without a chance to let that knowledge kind of be integrated into a bigger picture. Wisdom is the capacity to take the larger view, to step out of the immediate and to see the bigger picture. And that is a skill that can be developed, but it really only happens usually with a great deal of time. That's why we talk about age. I had a parishioner in Jamestown who was really interested in the fact that once we reach a certain age, nobody cares what our opinion is anymore. Did you notice that? Some of you who have reached a certain age, everything's about what do the young people think. And you're like, I finally got all this wisdom and nobody wants it. It's a terrible frustration. So he put together what he called the Saging Center. He said sages are those who have gained wisdom and can share it with others. And so he wanted to have an advisory group that would work with the political leaders of our community and the economic leaders and share their wisdom. The problem was the political leaders and the business leaders weren't that interested in all the wisdom that the sages had. So he shifted and he actually worked on how do you transition from your working life into retirement with a sense of meaning and purpose. That's what the Saging Center. But it was all about that issue of how do we gain in wisdom and then how do we share that wisdom. Well, I say all this because in today's Old Testament lesson, we meet the person in the Bible who is most associated with the virtue of wisdom. And that, of course, is King Solomon. Wise King Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon. He is a byword for wisdom. But Solomon, fascinatingly, made some foolish decisions, which I've always thought was ironic. Here he is, the paragon of wisdom, and yet he violates the most important commandment in the Bible. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. What does Solomon do? He worships other gods. Of all the boneheaded, foolish, idiotic things to do, he picked the number one, right? He didn't pick one of the lower down commandments. He picked number one. Not very wise. So what's with all this wisdom? So I was curious about this. How could this happen that the wisest man who ever lived made these dumb mistakes? And I thought, what's curious in his story is that he does not gain wisdom in the way that most of us do, through trial and error, through a life of hardship, of ups and downs, right? As I heard the stories of Mary and Carolyn, and I'm sure of Rob, and all these people, they had to learn wisdom through making mistakes, suffering the consequences, forgiving and being forgiven, right? That whole difficult part of life. That's what gained wisdom. But Solomon prayed for wisdom and he got it as a gift. It made me think of when my girls were little, they really wanted, there were no iPhones at the time, but there were iPods. Do you remember iPods? You played music on them and some games, and boy, they wanted an iPod. And so Margaret, the older one, we told her, we're good parents with the first child, less good with the second child. I don't know why that is, but with the first child, you've got to earn it. So she saves up her birthday money. She does some babysitting. It takes her almost a year to save enough money for this iPod. When she got that iPod, she treated it like it was a priceless relic. She wrapped it in bubble wrap. She carried it carefully. She cherished that iPod. A year later, her younger sister was given an iPod, I think by a grandparent. I want to say it was a grandparent. I don't want to say it was me. Received it as a gift, did not have to work for it, did not earn it, and that thing was broken within 3 months, right? First of all, the older sister was mad because her sister got one and she didn't have to work for it. You know how siblings are. But second of all, she didn't care for it as much because it was free. And I think maybe that's what was going on with Solomon. Maybe he took this wisdom for granted. Maybe he used it in his kingship, right? He had the famous story of splitting the baby in half. There's some great stories about Solomon's wisdom. But when it came to his own life, he had a shortcoming there. He was unable to see the consequences of his action. Wisdom is essential for us, but it's something that has to be developed. There's a certain kind of capacity that we can nurture in order to prepare ourselves to gain in wisdom. It doesn't come automatically. I was thinking about another story about a guy in a company. He worked there for 10 years. He was shooting for a promotion. He knew he was going to get the promotion. He looked around. He was the one who had the most experience. He was going to get that promotion. He did not get that promotion. Someone who had only worked there for 3 years got the promotion ahead of him, and he was upset. He went to his boss and said, "What gives? I have more experience. Why did you give the promotion to this other guy?" And the boss looked at him and smiled and said, "Well," he said, "I'll tell you what. You have a year of experience that you've repeated 9 times. You don't have 10 years of experience. You weren't learning. You weren't growing. You weren't developing. And so you're stuck right where you are." I think that happens a lot. So what makes the difference? How do we cultivate this fertile soil in which wisdom can grow? It requires things that our scriptures tell us about. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's what the psalmist says. Not fear as in fear of being smited by God. No, this is the awe and wonder, the recognition that we are not God, that we don't know everything, that we have a lot to learn. That sense of humility is critical for developing wisdom. Think about the wisest people you know. They are lifelong learners. They are curious. They are humble. They are interested in finding out about what's going on with other people and the world. They cultivate a sense. When Jack and his sister were giving the stories about their mom, and then other people were reflecting in these little things, what came through was Jack's mom radiated a sense of love. Everybody she talked to felt like they were the only person in the room. Her smile was infectious, her laugh was infectious, right? That's the kind of person who cultivates a sense of wisdom. And she had a hard life. Lots of people who live a long time go through stuff. You can't avoid it. You're going to go through some stuff. But do you come out the other side loving, accepting, humble, curious, and with a sense of this wonderful reciprocal love, right? That's the key to cultivating wisdom. We learn in Ephesians, St. Paul talks about this. So I like this. We need more people in choir. You want to gain wisdom? Sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, right? There you go. You can do that on Wednesday nights in choir practice and on Sunday mornings. There's something about that. There's something about worshiping together, right? We come here because we're seeking for God's wisdom to be in us, God's love. We're yearning for something to transform us. That's what happens in this community of love and faith. That's how we practice it. We make that fertile ground. Father John was saying that in the contemplative world, right? The mystics, the great sages of Christian history, they were people of knowledge, but more so, they took that knowledge and then what?
Sat in silence.
Sat in silence. Were able to reflect. Were able to integrate. Were able to see the connectedness between themselves and God and all of God's creation. Right? So the habits of prayer and contemplation, testing our story with God's story in the scriptures, worshiping together in fellowship, practicing loving service to God's world, all of these things cultivate the soil in which the wonderful tree of wisdom can grow and blossom. My prayer is that giving thanks for the people in our lives who have been inspirations to us. Think about, right now for me, all the people who have passed away, friends, parishioners, family members. I want to be more like them. And most of all, I want to be more like Jesus, cultivating a life that is grounded in God, that is growing in wisdom, and that above all else is